All right, get ready, because today we're really going to dig into habit formation. Yeah. We're not just going to scratch the surface. You want to understand what truly makes a behavior stick. And let me tell you, it's way more interesting than you might think.
Definitely more complex, too.
Totally. We're going deep into this study, and it's all about how researchers should be studying habits. They make a really strong case that real-world stuff is way more important than just lab results.
Yeah, I mean, in the real world, you've got a million little things going on, triggers and distractions, stuff you just can't recreate in a lab.
For sure. And that leads us to this first myth the study tackles, this idea that to form a habit, all you got to do is repetition, like just do it a bunch of times.
Right, as if you force yourself to go through the motions enough, it'll just magically become automatic. This study says, nope, not so fast.
It's kind of like when we try those new productivity hacks, you know? You might power through a whole new morning routine for a couple weeks, but does it last? Not always.
That's it. And the study really digs into the why. It's not actually about how often you do something. It's about the link between a cue and the behavior. It's like your brain's looking for patterns all the time. When you have a certain cue in your environment and it always comes before you do a specific thing, your brain starts connecting them.
So hold on, let me get this straight. We're talking about making these mental if-then statements in our brain.
You got it. If I see this specific cue, then I automatically do this specific thing. That's at the heart of what makes a habit stick. And that's also why simply doing something over and over without that clear cue might not be enough.
So it's like our brains are these habit detectives, always looking for clues and making these connections. And the more those connections fire, the more automatic that behavior gets, huh?
Precisely. That ingrained automatic if-then response, that's what we're after. And that brings us to another really important point. Another thing this research really challenges is this idea we have about habits forming in this like super straightforward way.
Yeah, like it's this straight line, right? You climb the ladder rung by rung and boom, automatic behavior.
Exactly. But this study, it's saying it's more like a curve, not this straight line. You get this quick burst of progress right at the beginning when your brain's just starting to link that cue and the behavior.
So you're all excited,
Right.
right? Because
Yeah.
you're seeing these wins early on. But then what?
And here's the thing. After that initial rush, things kind of level out. You keep doing the behavior, but you don't see those big leaps in habit strength, even if you're doing everything consistently.
It's like, I don't know, learning an instrument or something, right? Those first few chords you learn, those feel like massive wins. But then it's like you hit this plateau.
That's a great way to put it. And this is a big deal for anyone who's trying to build habits that actually stick. If you go into it knowing that progress isn't always going to be this straight shot up, it can really help you manage your expectations. You're less likely to get discouraged when those wins aren't as obvious later on.
It's like, yeah, those plateaus, they're normal. They're part of the process, not some sign that you're failing, right?
Mhm.
But I'm curious, do we know what those plateaus look like specifically? Is there like a typical pattern?
And this is where things get super interesting because the article, it actually points out that researchers are still debating the exact shape of this habit formation curve.
So there's no magic formula.
Not exactly. Some studies, they show the steep climb at the beginning and then boom, the sudden plateau that just keeps going. Others show a slower curve, more gradual, without those drastic shifts. There's even some research that suggests you might go through multiple plateaus, like mini breakthroughs along the way.
Okay, so maybe there's no one-size-fits-all model for how this works. But even just knowing that we should expect this back and forth, this ebb and flow in our progress, that's huge. It takes the pressure off trying to be perfectly consistent, you know?
Totally. And this actually leads us to another critical point this study emphasizes, and it's about how we study habit formation in the real world in the first place. Because as it turns out, a lot of studies, they might be going about it the wrong way.
Okay, now I got to know, what are they missing?
One of the biggest things the authors point out is that a lot of these studies, they're not actually measuring habit formation. They're focusing on people who already have really strong habits.
So instead of looking at how those habits were built, they're kind of starting at the finish line.
Exactly. Like trying to understand how someone learned a new language by just studying people who are already fluent, you're missing all those messy steps in between, right?
Makes sense. So how do we actually apply that idea, knowing that, to our own lives to actually building better habits?
It all comes down to focusing on change. It's not enough to just be like, I want to be more productive or I'm going to exercise more. You got to create an environment where those new links between cues and behaviors can actually form.
So it's about picking those very specific cues and those specific actions, the stuff that'll become the new habit, and then being intentional about making them part of your routine. And maybe even more importantly, it's about accepting that this stuff takes time, it takes trying things out, right?
Exactly. And that actually leads us to what you can really do to build those habits that last. Because remember, this study isn't just about poking holes in old research. It's got some really practical advice, too.
All right, let's get down to business. What are some things people can start using today? Okay, so we've busted some myths about habit formation. We've talked about those if-then connections our brains are making. But how do we actually put this into practice? What can we do to make those habits stick?
Well, the study highlights a few key things you can start doing today. The first one is be specific. Don't just aim for these vague goals like eat healthier or be more active. Break it down into concrete things you can actually do.
So instead of eat healthier, it's like, I'm going to swap out my afternoon soda for a glass of water.
Exactly. Remember those if-then statements we talked about? You got to give your brain that clear cue, that specific action to link it to.
Like setting up those dominoes,
Yeah.
right? You need that one precise push to get the whole thing going.
Love that analogy. And it actually ties into the next point. Start small, make it manageable. A lot of times when people try to build new habits, they go from 0 to 100, trying to change everything at once. It's just too much.
Yeah, it's like trying to learn a new language by like cramming an entire dictionary in a week.
Yeah.
You're setting yourself up to fail.
Right. Instead, pick one specific behavior, something super tiny and achievable, and just focus on doing that consistently. Once it starts to feel automatic, then you can think about adding in something else.
So it's about playing the long game, being patient, celebrating those small wins as you go. But how do you actually stay on track? Because, I mean, life's messy, right? There are going to be times you slip up.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where self-monitoring comes in. The study talks about how important it is to track your progress, not to judge yourself, but to actually learn from what's happening.
So like paying attention to what time of day it's easiest to stick to the new habit. Or maybe what are those unexpected obstacles that pop up? Even noticing how you feel when you succeed or when you don't.
Yeah. That stuff can be so insightful. You might realize, for example, that having a glass of water right after you brush your teeth in the morning, that makes it way more likely you'll stick with that hydration habit. Or maybe you realize that trying to work out after a long day, that's just never going to happen. But starting your day with a quick workout, that feels amazing.
It's about becoming this like scientist of your own habits, right? Observing, testing things out, and not being afraid to adjust based on what's working.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect. It's about figuring out what works for you and creating change that actually lasts.
This has been such a cool conversation. It's clear that habit formation, it's not just about willpower or discipline. It's about understanding how our brains work, working with ourselves, not against ourselves.
I think that's a great takeaway. Approach this whole thing with curiosity. Be willing to experiment and be kind to yourself along the way.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a ton today, but remember, this is just the beginning. Now it's time to take these ideas and actually use them. Until next time, happy habit forming.